In Chapter 6 of Informing with the Case Method, our main focus is on the conduct of case research. And our particular focus here is research cases as opposed to discussion cases, though there's a lot of concepts that carry over because good observation is good observation no matter what type of case you're trying to create. So my presentation of the conduct of case research is going to be a little different from Yin's because frankly if you're interested in traditional case research, your best bet is to go to Yin and not listen to me. So what we'll be talking about in this chapter to begin with, we'll talk about the distinction between traditional and agile methods of research, drawing a parallel between the programming using traditional systems development lifecycle and agile methods. And we'll try to identify situations where an agile perspective to the case method might be appropriate. We'll then talk about how you can build the validity of the research that you've done with the case method, because validity is going to be absolutely critical, particularly if you're trying to write case studies for publication. Finally, we'll talk a little bit about the research case write-up and some of the ancillary benefits of performing research cases. So we'll begin by taking a look at what I'd call the traditional research life cycle, and this life cycle really applies to almost any type of research, or at least empirical research, not just case studies, but the life cycle begins by designing, you then investigate, actually do what you plan to in your design, you do your analysis, and then finally you disseminate your end product. And as I say, this is nothing special, this is kind of common sense, but it represents the kind of traditional approach that we take to research. In software engineering, there's this notion of an agile method, which instead of having a straightforward series of steps in the construction of a system, involves building little bits and pieces of the system, testing it, revising it, and essentially going through an endless cycle. Well, you can really do your research in much the same way, particularly if you're dealing with case research. And in this type of research, what happens is you begin with, say, an observation of a site, and then you'll develop some questions based upon the observation. You won't necessarily go in with questions. You'll observe things, and that'll raise questions in your mind. Then you'll observe again and with those questions in mind, and then you'll test some possible explanations. Does this make sense or does this not make sense? Based upon the test, you might even have another observation in here. You'll revise your explanations. After you've revised them, you'll report the results in an initial way. You'll plan your next observation, and you will go through the cycle continuously. In this type of agile research, you're never very far away from reporting results. Just as in agile programming, you're never very far away from developing a working prototype or product. But in a cycle like this, you're constantly adapting based upon what you're seeing. And while this type of cycle may not be the best cycle for the generation of theory, it can be a very useful cycle for the generation of interesting observations because you're constantly adapting based upon what you find. While I would certainly not argue that this type of agile case method research is good for everything, I do think that there are times when it may be preferable to traditional research. And so what I've done is I prepared a kind of table here to illustrate, some of the key differences. If you look at the traditional on the left and the agile on the right, traditional tends to be planned in advance, systematic. Agile evolves based upon what you're seeing. Traditional research has clearly defined steps. In agile research, you're continuously revisiting the process, and it has no clear ending. In traditional research, the researcher tries to stay clear of the process being observed as much as possible so as not to interfere with it. In Agile research, it's virtually impossible for the researcher not to be involved, so the researcher accepts that involvement. A traditional research life cycle is driven by hypotheses, and ideally hypotheses established at the start of the process, whereas Agile research is really driven by the interesting things that we're observing as the process goes on. Traditional research life cycle produces conclusions based upon a hypothesis test. The Agile research is probably better at producing conceptual schemes sort of supported by the stories of what have been observed in the case. And traditional research life cycle is a best fit in static environments where the underlying relationships are not too complex. You know, that's where theory is really its most powerful. That's why disciplines like physics are so powerful and so strongly theory driven, because the rules of physics don't keep changing over time, and the underlying relationships in a field like physics sit on top of each other by a process called superposition. So if two bodies, say two planets, have a certain attraction to each other through gravity, you can add as many planets as you want, and the nature of the attraction between the original two will not change. It's just the additional attractions will be superimposed on top of it. Now, in an agile world, it's best fit with dynamic environments, because dynamic environments give you this opportunity to watch changes as they unfold, and where underlying relationships are complex, so we really don't anticipate coming up with theory. What we're looking is for quick-acting conceptual schemes that we can spread around so that other individuals in similar situations can look at them and decide if they're applicable to their particular situation. And they won't always decide that they are. But nevertheless, a 5-year-old conceptual scheme in a dynamic environment is unlikely to be very useful if that environment truly is dynamic. So what are the types of things that might drive our Agile research in terms of what's interesting? And there are a number of things that you might encounter in case research that would pique your interest. For example, when you see an unexpected observation, that would be interesting. When you see oddly similar observations, that would be interesting. You know, you expect them to be different, yet they actually behave the same. Oddly different observations are interesting. If we have two very similar contexts and wildly different outcomes, that's interesting. That's evidence of a very rugged fitness landscape where tiny differences in attributes can produce big differences in outcomes. Patterns in sets of observations can be very interesting. When I did my doctoral dissertation at Harvard, I found the results of that dissertation to be wildly uninteresting, because I concluded very early on that practice really was not going to benefit from anything I said, because they were handling the problem I was looking at perfectly well on their own. In other words, I've chosen a problem based on the literature, not based on the needs of practice. The most useful thing I found from that experience was a sort of pattern regarding what types of systems were successful and what systems were not successful out of a group of about a dozen systems. It was not a large enough pattern to be statistically significant, but nevertheless, I thought it was kind of interesting. And so when I got to my first university, I designed a research project that would look at 97 of these systems and see if the pattern held. And in truth, the pattern held. In fact, that pattern held a lot stronger than I had hoped it would, and so that produced a couple of top-tier journal articles. But the original insights were all from patterns I observed in a very small number of observations. Other things that might be of interest is a lack of relevance to practice, where perhaps we think something should be very important, but in practice it doesn't seem to be very important. There's lots of research dealing with things of that nature. For example, within the learning literature, there's this notion of learning styles. And when you read about them, you just know they've got to be important. and you start thinking, how can I design my course to take into account different learning styles? The problem is that virtually none of the evidence that we've accumulated actually indicates that they actually are important in real world situations. So that's an interesting observation you might make in a case. Similarly, you might make an observation that something that has not been talked about seems very relevant in a practical context. So all of these things are interesting, and all of these things would be worth following up in an Agile case method. If you're dealing with a traditional research, you don't really have the same ability to follow up on things like this because you're somewhat constrained by your protocol. Because as soon as you vary significantly from your design, then the rigor of your research process is going to be called into question. If you want your research to have any impact, and this is really true of any type of research, one of the things that you need to do is you need to build its credibility. And in the world of academic research, this normally falls under the heading of validity. There are basically 4 types of validity that we frequently talk about. The first is reliability, which we can sort of summarize. Do the same questions produce the same answers? Sometimes if you make changes to the wording of a question, it can produce a big change in response rate. Well, if you think you're asking the same question and it's producing big variations in response, that means that your questions aren't very good in terms of getting reliable data. Another type of validity is construct validity. We have a conceptual scheme which involves constructs, such as the notion of user satisfaction or self-efficacy or all sorts of other constructs. So the question is, do these constructs appear in multiple sources? In other words, does it appear that the constructs are real, or are they just something we made up for convenience? And can we tell them apart? Sometimes you have 2 constructs that are so similar to each other, it's really impossible to tell them apart. That's sometimes referred to as discriminant validity, and if you can't discriminate between them, they're not very good constructs. Another type of validity is what's called internal validity, and this is really the internal consistency of our arguments and any explanations we have, are they supported by evidence? So whether or not what we're doing generalizes to the outside world, if it's internally inconsistent, nobody's going to believe it. The final type of validity is sometimes referred to as external validity, and really this is the question of generalizable. If we have some significant results, such as having users involved in the product design produces better products, then what evidence do we have that these things actually generalize to a real world context, or even generalize to the organization that we're looking at, and not just the specific artificial situation that we've put people in? So whenever you're doing research for publication, or if you're trying to convince people in your organization based upon your research, you always need to think about these 4 areas. And in case research, you have to deal with them in different ways than you would in traditional, say, statistical research, because some of these types of constructs, such as reliability, construct validity, and internal validity, you can get a lot of support from those from statistical means that may not be available to you when you're doing a case study. So how does the validity of case research differ from the validity testing that you might have in other research designs? Well, if we look at the traditional research design, our validity tests rely heavily on past research for hypotheses in research design. That helps us with construct validity. We pilot our testing instruments, which means we do a lot of pre-tests. This helps a lot with reliability. We have a carefully designed protocol, which is designed to help us with our sort of internal consistency, and statistical tests help us deal again with internal validity. And consistency with past results tends to provide some notion of external validity. Now, when we look at case research, we really have to deal with these things in a somewhat different way because we don't necessarily have this carefully designed protocol. We don't necessarily have these statistical tests. We don't have pilot tested instruments, and we may not be doing hypothesis testing in the kind of agile case method research that I'm talking about. So here, we have interactive interviews that help us deal with reliability. When I did a case study, one of the ways I argued for reliability is I had the respondents answer a form while I was on the telephone, and if any of their answers did not seem consistent with the nature of the system that they were involved in, I asked them about it. And sometimes they would give me an explanation which indicated that they had exactly the right idea, and sometimes they gave an explanation which suggested they didn't understand the question, which can be a big problem with reliability. So I asked the question in a different way, or I clarified the question, and that way I had a much better sense that the instrument was reliable. We have researchers that are subject matter experts. That's much more important in case method research than traditional research. In traditional research, you can have a researcher assign the task of data gathering or analysis to graduate students who may not be that expert in the particular domain, but that's all right because the real area of expertise required by them is expertise in the statistical tool. In case method research, you really benefit from having an expert in the domain interpreting the research for you, and that helps us with the internal and external validity as well as the construct validity. You collaborate with study participants here. Once again, it allows you to get additional insights into the reliability and internal validity of what you're doing, and you develop a logically consistent, credible narrative. Once again, this helps you with your internal validity. There are going to be some people who will never be convinced by the results of a case study, but on the other hand, there will be people who are not only convinced by it, but use the story as an example and as a way of communicating what you found into future generations of students in the literature. So when it comes time to actually write up your case research, there are variations in how you can write it up. For the most part, even if you've used relatively non-traditional data gathering methods, I would encourage folks to use the traditional research write-up if they're actually interested in publishing in an academic journal. Because ultimately, if you give your reviewers any other type of write-up, there's a really good chance that they are going to complain about it because it will confuse them. Because as a research reviewer, you're often encountering stuff that's very unfamiliar to it. And if you add an unfamiliar organization on top of that, it will be rather difficult. So what does this traditional case research write-up tend to look like? Well, it tends to begin with an introduction. That makes sense. We move on to a literature review. If you do not have a literature review in your write-up, what will happen is everyone will assume that you haven't read the literature and then you will not get published. You have relevant theory and hypotheses. Your traditional research is built upon hypothesis testing and theory. You describe your data gathering protocol. You create your narrative of the case. You perform your analysis and discussion, and you come to your conclusions. One real complaint I have about this traditional write-up is that all the meat of the case, the story, is confined to a very, very small part of the research. And I think that interferes with its ability to be resonant and effective. But that is a fundamental characteristic of traditional research write-ups, and I don't expect that to change. There are, however, alternatives you could consider. Another approach to writing up case research is what I call the example explanation organization. And I'm not suggesting that this is the path to publication in top-tier journals, but it can make for rather interesting research. And I've used it a number of times in my own research. And basically, what this research is much more faithful to the notion of a case as a story. And so what you do is you begin by telling a compelling story, taking as much time as needed, But the story has to have some interesting aspects. It has to have some behaviors that seem inconsistent with what you'd expect. It has to have a hook that engages the reader and wants the reader to demand an explanation. Once you've hooked the reader and you've got them demanding an explanation, then what you can do is you can provide that explanation, and you can use research from past research showing why we'd expect this to happen or why we might not expect it to happen, and what is sometimes referred to as grounded theory, which means making stuff up to fit the situation. And I also refer to this as conceptual scheme building, trying to come up with a nice, resonant way of explaining what happened. While I don't think this is the type of organization that your traditional research journals will favor, nevertheless, it can make for a very interesting presentation. So you have to understand what it is your primary objective. Are you interested in gaining further acclaim as a researcher, or are you interested in actually making your readers interested in what you're writing? And I suspect the distinction is not quite as sharp as that, but I think that this organization can be really good if you've got a great story to tell. When contrasting the two types of write-up, you really need to think a little bit about the virtues of each and what you're trying to accomplish. So the virtues of traditional research is that it can be very objective in form, the traditional write-up and the traditional research. It can be fully anonymous. You as the case writer do not have to enter into it at all because you've been very careful only to observe, and you can make it reasonably concise because you're not trying to explain a very complicated situation. If we go to the kind of case method agile research that I'm talking about, it has some virtues too. It can be much more engaging to read. I always hate it when the story is pulled out of case research because there isn't enough room because of the literature review and all these other things that you have to put in. It is likely not to be anonymous. It's likely to have identifying information about the researcher and the organization if it's any good, and so that can be argued as a problem with objectivity. And it does, however, provide a nice background and information for subsequent research if you've done it better. So whereas you may present your case research as a particular experiment, if you provide enough background, it can actually be like an observation used in subsequent research if they can verify what they needed from the write-up that you have given. So I would say both types of research have their own virtues, both types of write-ups have their own virtues, and which you want to choose really depends a lot on what you're trying to accomplish. So I would summarize the chapter as follows. When you're conducting case research, alternative paths exist. You should not assume that there's only one right way to perform it. If you go with the traditional path, you're likely to have strength of design and rigor, and you can emphasize the triangulation and sell yourself that way. And frankly, there's a lot of demand for good case research within the academic literature. There are rumors floating around that cases are hard to get published, but I don't think that's true. I think cases are hard to write, particularly good case research, but once you've written good case research, I think the odds that it will be published are very high. If you go down the non-traditional path, you're going to have greater adaptability in what you're looking at, and you're likely to produce results that will be more interesting to a reader, particularly not a reader who is not immersed in the literature of the field. The validity of the two paths is really achieved in different ways. In traditional research, you have a lot of statistical tools, and even in traditional case research, Yin provides a lot of suggestions for demonstrating the reliability, internal validity, construct validity of what you're doing. In the Agile research, it's basically you're relying on triangulation and the word of the people involved. You'll probably never get the same objective validity, but in a dynamic world, some objective validity may be illusory at best because the world keeps changing. If we think about alternative write-up styles, they each have their own pros and cons, and really the write-up style you choose is likely to depend upon the audience that you're interested in. So if you're interested in eventually writing for an audience of practitioner, you're much more likely to focus heavily on the story, whereas if you're interested in focusing on an audience of academic researchers, chances are you're going to be more interested in focusing on methodology and the appearance of rigor.